Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to tackle the movie Virtuosity. Reasonably, we have a tour in this movie. We have kind of a futuristic approach to quite possibly trying to track down and or take down a killer. And to ultimately, we have a tour. There's seemingly one virtual reality killer that has been amassing of knowledge of seemingly 180 murderers, killers, criminals of sorts. And so, reasonably, we have it to where Denzel's character's job is to ultimately try to figure out if we could ultimately take down this person. And we have it to where we end up having that journey of that. So, visually interesting movie, and I think that's what ultimately caught my eye, but also this being really tying into a virtual world also kind of tied me into that as well, of just being the fact that it's like, okay, well, this seems like it's a future way of ultimately getting to someone. So ultimately, this movie is on Hulu, Hulu, and so reasonably at the end of the day, you could say that you've gone and seen this film. I think reasonably I like the just there's some interesting things that ultimately kind of make it to where we have in here that Russell Crowe is a very interesting character. He kind of reminds me of almost a quasi Joker Ash like character to Denzel's Batman, if I do say. Um, we honestly have it to where Russell Crowe does have some interesting action scenes. Trust me, he goes and kills some people. And so, yeah, kind of a person that kind of kills without thinking, kind of thing, and really that's just the escalation of where Sid of 6.7, Russell Crowe's character, eventually goes into of just like wanting to break the rules to ultimately go and do whatever he wants, kind of thing. And so that's what ends up happening within this movie. So, excuse me. So, recently in this movie, we have a way of detectives trying to ultimately try and track down a killer. It is kind of made as a like a training scenario, but it ends up to where eventually that training scenario is eventually going to falter and no longer work, to where eventually we have it to where this virtual entity wants to make his way to the real world, and we ultimately have that same one detective that ultimately had seemingly taken some time to understand uh, Sid's character is ultimately left to be the only one man left to track him down, to take him down, to be able to pull him back into where he's left to at the very end of this movie. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly Sid eventually once we get to see him, we find out that he is able to do some interesting things to eventually put himself back together at some points. And yeah, there's some kind of there's some technical stuff that really kind of shows to the time of things, and I thought that that was kind of really interesting as well. Just kind of see the approach of these characters, and eventually they have to show CGI like stuff and things along those natures. So, anyways, I thought it was kind of interesting to eventually see like Denzel in prison and eventually see him kind of make his way to be able to make it back to be ultimately a part of seemingly the police force at some point. And we ultimately get a real true backstory of where Denzel had come to before being a part of this training or Esh like scenario. So, if anything, let's go into double five time to ultimately break down and ultimately talk about this movie without the handcuffs of ultimately not going far too in and spoiling this film. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil whew, this movie. So in the very beginning of this film, we ultimately have Denzel's character, Parker Barnes, and ultimately we have or John Donovan, that ultimately are two fledgling detectives trying to get to Sid 6.7. So we ultimately have it to where we have these two detectives that are just kind of running around town. Ultimately, it seems like every single person in this city are all wearing the exact same suits, even to where females wearing the exact same suits as the males, which I thought was weird. So we end up having it to where Denzel is kind of looking all around and he is finding a building that has a uh, a smiley face symbol, two dots and a crescent or a swerved S like shape to off to the side look like a smiley face. Now we have emojis and stuff like that, but ultimately, when we used to text and stuff like that, we'd always have like a symbol of a smile to ultimately tell, like, convey to people that hey, we're happy, or hey, we're this, or hey, we're angry, or maybe there's other some kind of symbols. But now we have like emojis that ultimately can convey those things. But a lot of times I would really not care to use emojis all that often, because recently I could just like text like the words like happy or I'm happy or whatever, instead of using an emoji of sorts. I don't know. But anyways, so we go into here, and ultimately Denzel is to go into this building, and we eventually find it to where ultimately it is like some sushi restaurant of sorts, and we ultimately have it to where seemingly Donovan and Barnes's character, ultimately Barnes is Denzel, ultimately we have them separate, and we eventually find it to where Barnes ultimately can figure out where exactly Sid's character is, and eventually he does find them, and he ends up having it to where Sid ultimately gives Barnes' character the heads up that he probably could have shot him, but ultimately we have it to where Denzel ends up uh, laying some uh, laying what is almost bullets into Sid. So, but it ends up that ultimately we have to where Sid ends up shocking Denzel's character by basically putting in some fingers into what is to be Barnes's already, excuse me, bullet wound anyways, and so we end up having it to a reasonably that both uh, we find out that Donovan Don that John Donovan was ultimately killed, and we find out that ultimately Barnes ultimately had gotten shocked, but he's still alive. So reasonably, we were assumed that Donovan had died, and ultimately Denzel is okay. So we end up having it found out that reasonably that like electrocution or being shocked or whatever was not one of the rules, and so ultimately we have it to where we have uh, William uh, Cochran. Cochran, I want to say Cochran. Ultimately looking over uh, Barnes is doing his thing, and he's so excited as like, yeah, like I'm so excited to be able to see you do your thing again, even if it is within a virtual world. So we have it to ultimately we find out that it seems that Barnes had ultimately been uh, while he had been waiting for them to set things up, it seems that Barnes has been able to find things about this company. And when eventually he showcases it to his superiors, we end up having the people at this place end up having an uproar about it. 'Cause it's like, well, like that is something you should not have been looking into, kind of thing. So, and plus, we have to where Sid is ultimately kind of keeping things under wraps. Um, so that way no one will know. He's kind of keeping everything copacetic, so no one will find out about the underhanded things that they are able to do. So we end up having a character called Lendenmeyer that ultimately is going and talking to Sid and saying, you know what, like I think you went a little bit too far in this scenario. There were some things that you weren't protocol to do and stuff like that. And Sid is like, well, like I'm evolving, like I'm trying to be more, and reasonably that's all I want to do is be more. And we have it to where eventually Lindenmeyer is ultimately seemingly going to be a puppet, so to speak, for Sid to ultimately do whatever he wants. And we have it to where eventually we have Sid that is ultimately going to become a real boy at some point. So we have it to where reasonably we have a man that is ultimately uh, called Clyde Riley that is ultimately going to see uh, a female virtual character, and we have it where this Riley character is ultimately seeing this girl and is ultimately saying, oh, okay, well, could I possibly make this girl a real living, breathing thing? And we have it to her, and we have it to her. Lindenmeyer is like, yeah, of course we can, and so we have it to where Sid is also playing with this virtual girl and playing around with her, uh, Sheila 3.2, and ultimately going and uh, pressing Lindenmeyer to do what he wants, which is to ultimately make Sid a real living, breathing man. So we ultimately have it to where Riley is going to not get what he wants, but so we ultimately have it to where Sid is ultimately in the case of Sheila's, and so we eventually have it to where Lendenmeyer ultimately puts in uh, to this to this apparatus of sorts to turn Sid into a real guy. And immediately we have it to where Sid, when becoming real, ultimately kills off this Riley character. And we have it to where Lindenmeyer ultimately runs off like a coward because he doesn't want to get killed by this guy, because immediately he knows the first thing that's going to happen is that he is going to get killed. So we ultimately have it to where when after Barnes gets to be done with his job with the police, we ultimately find out that it seems that Barnes had been a police officer before, and ultimately the real reason why he had ended up getting arrested and put into jail was ultimately because he had gone out of his way to kill the people that had taken his wife and kid. And so ultimately, he would not stop until he killed everybody, even if it wasn't the people that absolutely deserved it. But anyways, so and plus he like disobeyed a direct order and all that kind of jazz. So we end up having to where Barnes is ultimately going into uh, seek where he is supposed to be in within this prison, and it seems like they're putting him in general population or whatever, where ultimately we have it to where Barnes' character is ultimately talking to the person that is going to put him in the place to be uh, with everyone else at. We ultimately have it to where Barnes is yelling out that's like, hey, you're putting me in the wrong section. You're putting me in Gen Pop. I can't do that because I'm a cop. And we ultimately have it to where the security guard is like, oh, well, you'll just have to deal with it because you're a cop. So we ultimately have it to where Barnes goes out into general population, and we have it to where ultimately we have Barnes' character that is going to have to fight some guy and beat the living crap out of him out of self defense. And so we end up having Barnes going uh, and ultimately talking to Mason Carter, and he is talking to her, and Mason Carter ultimately mentions it's like, well, hey, like, why did you go and you killed one of the other prisoners? Like, why'd you go out of your way to kill this person? And Barnes is like, I didn't go out of my way to kill this person. I went out of my way to defend myself because someone was trying to kill me. And so we have it to where Barnes is ultimately like not giving this girl any inch because he's smarter than her, and we eventually have it to where Barnes is ultimately going, and after Sid eventually goes and gets out, we ultimately have it to where the people that ultimately are to work um, with the government and all these kind of red tape like things, we ultimately find out that reasonably that Barnes is ultimately going to be released to go after Russell Crowe's character. We ultimately have it to where seemingly that they are going to put a tracker in Barnes's neck to ultimately keep track of Barnes, but he's ultimately going to get released out into the world to ultimately track down Sid, and but they are going to keep a leash on him for probably the rest of his entire life. So we have a tour Barnes ultimately hearing about this proposal eventually coming his way. We have a tour Barnes is like, wait, seriously? Like, you seriously want me to get out of bed for this and ultimately to either be one, spending the rest of my years in prison, or two, having me go out in the world and get my freedom and get my pardon after I do this case for you guys, which ultimately I could get killed doing anyways. Uh, but then even if I do put this man away, I am still ultimately going to be tracked for the rest of my life, um, with this thing in my neck. So we ultimately have it to where Barnes ultimately is to agree with this case, and so reasonably we have it to where ultimately Russell Crowe eventually goes and starts killing people. Just starts going off into certain like special events, cage fighting and stuff like that to just try to go off and uh, I would call, God, what is the word? Um, we have it to where ultimately Sid's character is ultimately trying to make uh, a visual of sorts or a symbol of sorts to ultimately let to ultimately let Barnes know exactly where he's going to be and exactly who he's going to kill. It seems that Sid is able to tie himself onto TVs of sorts to where ultimately we have it to where Sid can kind of be anywhere at any time. But anyways, so we have it to where ultimately Barnes is putting himself back into the world, and eventually we have it to where we find out that Mason Carter has a kid, and so ultimately we have it to where Barnes is kind of talking to this kid, um, ultimately kind of mentioning about his gun and if he had to ever shoot anybody or anything like that. Uh, and here's where we ultimately find out eventually that uh, Barnes had lost his arm, sort of, because ultimately we have such high technology that Barnes eventually he has to just kind of have a certain kind of a bizarre looking attachment to his arm to ultimately keep his arm. But anyways, so we eventually have it to where Russell Crowe is, as Sid, is kind of keeping certain people hostage at some point, and ultimately it seems that when uh, anyone is to come in to try to take him down, ultimately he just slays a bunch of people. So eventually we have it to where Sid just keeps going and hopping from place to place to place to just continue to kill people, and we eventually find out that it seems that Sid, uh, through these technological people, he had found out that ultimately if he could take glass and be able to heal himself via using glass. So we have it to where eventually Sid, at some point when his windshield is ending up getting shot, he's ending up like eating glass at some point. And I was like, oh my god, that's a horrific looking visual. But then when looking at it, it's like, oh, well, all that I'm sure was all just fake, and Sid was just and whatever, fakely eating some glass in sorts to ultimately heal himself. Because we have it to where ultimately Sid is consistently, repetitiously hit with fire to the point to where Sid has to be worried that ultimately he will not be able to heal fast enough or ultimately won't recover from these injuries. And so we have it to where Sid is eventually evading Barnes's character consistently. So we go on to eventually have Barnes, after going through all these places, through these scenarios, through a cage fighting like environment, and so on and so forth, we end up having it to where one, Sid is eventually grabbing some purple uh, suit from off of some man, and eventually Sid is to continually, repetitiously go through these environments to ultimately go and continue to kill people as much as he wants. So we eventually have it to where Sid is ultimately mimicking a killer that ultimately Barnes knows. That ultimately that killer had cost Denzel's uh, wife and daughter their lives. And so we have it to where Denzel is chasing after a ghost. But we have to where Barnes is also not being, he's not being triggered by this guy because Barnes is ultimately saying, hey man, I killed my wife and daughter's killer. Like, this guy is a copycat. He's trying to mimic this guy, but I know I had killed the killer of my wife and daughter. So we eventually have it to where at some point in time we find out that that Sid makes it all the way to this subway, and we have it to where Barnes is ultimately having quite possibly a trigger finger on on Sid, and we end up having it seem that Barnes had taken fire to this pedestrian to ultimately get to Sid, but we find out later that the wound had come from behind instead of from the front. So so ultimately we are to deem that quite possibly Barnes would easily go and kill a civilian at some point. So we have it to where ultimately Barnes ends up getting arrested because they assume that Barnes had killed or had tried to kill this civilian to get to Sid, and so they easily arrest Barnes. Ultimately, to have Sid help Barnes try to escape uh, from his arrest, from him being arrested. So that way Sid can consistently play with Barnes, and to where Barnes is to scramble and to try and consistently find Sid wherever he is. So eventually we have it to where Sid is to eventually find Mason Carter's child. And so we have it to where eventually Sid hides Mason Carter's child to try and figure out where, um, like, basically, Sid has it to where ultimately he has to. Blah, 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 blah. So, blah, let's go back at this again. So, ultimately Sid arrested and stuff like that. So eventually we have it to where Mason Carter's kid is ultimately with Sid, and so now we have to figure out where Mason Carter's kid is. So we have it to where Denzel is making his way to fight off Sid, and so we eventually get it to where within this scenario that we are to believe that Sid is consistently healing himself. So eventually, Sid will be able to keep battling on and on. So we eventually have it to where Denzel is trying to scramble to find this kid. And so eventually, we have it to where Sid has to figure, or Denzel's character has to figure out where Sid had hidden this kid. And it gets to the point to where it seems that there's a virtual world trying to figure out where Sid hid this kid. And because we have to eventually to where Denzel's character eventually kills uh, Sid's body and eventually takes the ability to have Sid thinks that he's still in the real world, which he's not. Because we ultimately have it to where Denzel eventually fakes his death to ultimately help us figure out where the kid is. And so Sid ends up taking us to where the kid is. So ultimately, we have it uh, to where Barnes's character in the real world uh, finds Sid's Sid's hostage. So eventually, we have to where Barnes goes and ultimately tries to get this kid out, but eventually there is some kind of bomb of sorts that is otherwise tied to this kid, where ultimately Barnes has to defuse that, and ultimately he does by using some arm attachment that he has to ultimately defuse this girl's bomb. So eventually we have it to where Sid's characters to ultimately uh, mention that he is going to outsmart Barnes with this bomb, and ultimately every little thing he does, Sid had thought too. So we eventually have it to where Barnes tricks this bomb to ultimately just keep repetitiously say the same, excuse me, the same scenario in a loop over and over and over and over again to ultimately just make it assumed that this bomb is never going to actually go off. So we have it to where ultimately now reasonably the bomb is never going to go off, and ultimately the kid is saved to go back to her mother. So it seems like everything is going to work out, and it seems like this is the way of which to have a happy ending with things. Eventually, they end up arresting Lindenmeyer and basically anybody that's going to have a part of this company is ultimately just kind of just gone to the wayside because reasonably it's just kind of like, well, you guys have done some underhanded things and ultimately a lot of stuff that you guys were continuously going and to have maliciously give someone harm. It's like, nope. So we ultimately have it to where Sid is back into the virtual world and he's stuck there to ultimately be killed off. Because reasonably we're gonna have it to where Sid is ultimately not going to be an entity that could be used anymore. So yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to say at the end of the day for this movie. I thought that it was a really interesting film, but I think that's all that I wanted to say about it. It was just an interesting visual adventure, but other than that, that's all I wanted to say. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.